All right, class. Thank you for joining me once again. Stop chewing that gum. Stop throwing paper darts. Pay attention. We're dealing with people who want to be wrong on the interwebs. Again, today's willing contestant is one Thomas De Lauer, who wants to say all sorts of ridiculous things that are completely wrong, and as such, we'll have to put him right, wherever that is, which is pretty much everywhere, Thomas. Really poor show, son. Really, really poor show indeed. Anyway, Thomas, off you go.
We think because we're reducing the amount of carbs that we eat, or we're watching our sugar intake, that we're totally scot-free of any potential issues when it comes down to insulin resistance.
Okay, so straight away, Thomas, there's your first mistake. Insulin resistance is a concept. It's a construct. It's an idea. There is no piece of kit that you can use to measure insulin resistance. What you can measure is someone's level of insulin in their blood under given conditions or over a time series under given conditions and circumstances. You can do the same for blood glucose. You can do the same for all sorts of physiological reactions and levels of various different things, but you cannot directly measure insulin resistance itself. It is an idea. The idea being that you're producing insulin, but it is not working. And then insulin resistance is then generally broken into further subcategories: chronic or acute. Acute being a short-term blockade to the action of insulin, and of course chronic being a long-term or lasting blockade to that effect. What you need to understand, people, including you, Thomas, is that insulin resistance occurs in the human body for a reason. Okay? It has a purpose. It has evolved in us over at least the last 4.5 million years, precisely to protect the delicate organelles, lipid membranes, DNA, etc., inside our important cells, like our muscle cells, for example, and our liver cells and all of those kind of things, from the damage that they would experience were those cells exposed to a level of sugar that is too high. Okay? It's an energy balance in terms of substrates available in the cytosol of the cytosol of the cell issue, and it is under the control of a system of or a part of the metabolic system, if you like, called the Randall cycle. Okay? I've done a number of very, very fine videos in the past on the Randall cycle, if you'd like to go and educate yourselves on these. Basically, insulin resistance is a short-term and immediate blockade of the action of insulin from allowing the cell to open the door to let in sugar. When the Randall cycle is activated for long periods of time, or indeed pretty much all the time, then we have this concept that we call insulin resistance chronically. It's not chronic. All you need to do is unlock those doors, and I'll get to that as you make some progress, Thomas. So off you go.
Well, it doesn't seem to be the case. You see, fats can actually influence insulin resistance too.
Yes, there are 3 things that will cause the metabolic system, the Randall cycle, to lock the doors of cells to the intake and utilization of sugar. What are they? First of all, when the cell cytosol is replete with energy in the form of sugar, the doors are locked strongly, immediately. And until the cell level drops significantly below that level of sugar so that the doors can open and sugar can start to flood back into that cell, thus preventing that cell from becoming overloaded with sugar. Fine. Another way you can do it is to fill the cell with all the energy it needs in the form of fat in which case the Randall cycle will lock out sugar and lock out the cell to sugar. Quite rightly so. It has all the energy it needs. It does not need any sugar. We've evolved not eating hardly any sugar at all, Thomas, for 4.5 million years, son. Sugar is not designed, human beings are not designed to live on any significant amount of sugar. We are designed to run on fat and to use protein as our building blocks. That's the design. Sugar was never part of the design until humans intervened and technologically invented all of these carbohydrate food sources. And yes, I mean invented. There are no plant foods that you can currently go to the supermarket and buy that existed a couple of hundred years ago. Okay? So fill the cell with fat, it locks the door to sugar, rightly so. Fill the cell with sugar, same thing happens, it locks the door. Mix fats and sugars together, it locks the door even more strongly and for an even longer period of time. Okay? The only time you are designed to get any energy from sugar, really, is when there is no fat floating around in the blood. Sugar is toxic. Sugar will always be used up before fat. And if you get a mixture of fat and sugar into the cell, the door is locked, the cell drains the sugar out, and then the door is reopened to see what is external to the cell and what starts pouring in. And that will determine whether the cell doors are relocked or whether they remain open. Has the level of nutrient in the blood changed in the interim that we've had the door locked? The only way to find out is to unlock the door and see what comes in. Whoops, still too much sugar, lock the door again. Okay? Very straightforward. So yes, fats can lock the door to sugars, and rightly so. That is not a pathological situation. That's not a failure of some kind. That's not a disease of any kind. Okay? The disease, diabetes, for example, is elevated blood sugar. Nothing else. Not insulin, anything. Not insulin resistance, not too much insulin. No, diabetes is elevated blood sugar. That's how it's diagnosed. That's what the pathological situation is. That's what needs fixing. Okay? The insulin system's variable response is part of your design. It's there for a reason. It works perfectly. And you can change that situation rapidly. How do you do it? Stop eating carbohydrates. Period. Okay, what's next?
And this is a little bit sketchy because it kind of throws a wrench in a lot of what we look at. But if we understand the kinds of fats, we understand the amounts, and we understand the basic physiology, it can help us.
Yeah, but Thomas, you don't, son. You have no training in this area to speak of. You have no decent credentials in this area to speak of. You have no ability to actually engage with this in a sensible and responsible fashion. And as such, you should not be so doing. This is contraindicated disinformation from you. It's not okay, Thomas. Please stop immediately. Don't make any more videos about nutrition, son. You are out of your depth. Okay, what's next?
Out a bunch. I'm talking mainly about palmitate, okay, a type of saturated fat that you're going to find in most meats and a lot of cheeses and things like that. Okay, now we have to understand, first of all, there's this thing called HMGA. HMGA is a nuclear factor, which means it activates gene transcription for insulin receptors. An insulin receptor is where insulin ultimately binds to, okay? So if insulin receptors are not being created, then you have less places for insulin to bind to, which can certainly lead to insulin resistance because...
And it's indicated because if you have a diet rich in palmitate, then the energy you require is being supplied by that palmitate, and pouring in additional toxic contraindicated sugar on top of that is a bad idea. What's your problem?
The insulin has nowhere to bind. Now, what does saturated fat have to do with this in general? Well, excess saturated fat...
There is no such thing, Thomas, any more than excess carbohydrate or excess protein or excess water or excess anything. You are absolutely biologically designed to gain the vast majority of your effective energy for metabolic process from saturated animal fats, Thomas.
has been linked to a sustained downregulation in the expression of insulin receptors.
For the exact reasons I've been talking about. It is indicated physiologically, it is indicated for the safety of the cell and the organism as a whole. It is according to plan. It is not a pathological situation.
Genes. What this means is that when we overeat saturated fat, which by the way is very...
You can't overeat saturated fat except if you are overeating energy effectively in total, if you are eating too much food. But 100% pretty much of your energy effectively in the form of fat is fine. So long as you keep up your protein intake requirements to subserve the protein turnover needs of your body, that is not a problem at all, Thomas.
Very easy to do, especially on a low-carb protocol.
Nonsense. It's very, very difficult to overeat on a protein and fat-only diet, Thomas. Very difficult. Not easy at all. It's very, very easy to overeat on sugar because sugar causes you to have a rapid, vast insulin response to get the sugar into the cells. That pulls your blood sugar down lower than it was beforehand and makes you feel hungrier again sooner. Okay? Fat and protein don't do that. Okay?
It actually changes the gene expression so we don't produce as many insulin receptors.
Yes, for the reasons I've spoken about. It is indicated, normal. It has a purpose. That's what it is. It's to protect the delicate inner workings of cells from toxic overburden of sugar, which is pretty much any at all in the diet, Thomas. And by sugar, I mean all carbohydrates, because they all break down to what, Thomas? Sugar. What's next?
There was an interesting study. It was published in Cellular Physiology and Biochemistry, and it looked specifically at this. It looked at skeletal muscle tissue, and it found that skeletal muscle tissue cells that were treated with palmitate, with saturated fat, and then exposed to insulin, well, there was a 2x decrease in the occupation of insulin receptors.
For the reasons I have already explained. This is not a surprise, Thomas. This is indicated.
Meaning that half the insulin receptors weren't even receiving the signal from glucose anymore.
Of course they weren't, because the cells need to protect themselves from toxic overburden of carbohydrates and sugars. Goodness, this isn't hard to understand. If you have 5 minutes of training in the area, which, Thomas, you clearly don't.
After there was a lot of saturated fat in the equation. Okay, what is potentially going on here?
Well, I've explained exactly what's going on here. It's very simple. We need no further explanations, and you're going to get this wrong, I bet. I haven't watched this through. This is my first time.
Understand it, we can fix it. So there was a study that was published in Diabetes, Obesity, and Metabolism. I found this very interesting because it was a post-mortem study. So it took a look at people that had passed away. And they hypothesized that approximately 50% of the insulin-producing cells have already died by the time people are diagnosed with diabetes. What this means is that we're not really producing insulin properly, even by the time most people are diagnosed. Now, what does this have to do with this whole saturated fat equation? Well, it actually tells us a lot more of everything. You see, when we produce insulin, producing insulin is a product of receiving energy from fuel. So it is our fuel supply, whether it's glucose or fat or anything, that ultimately fuels a pancreatic beta cell, which produces insulin. Okay, so glucose or fats, they will fuel it.
Oh, Thomas, appalling, son. Sugar stimulates the production of insulin strongly and immediately, hugely, orders of magnitude more than anything else. Protein stimulates insulin much, much less, much more slowly, and over a longer period, to which your body responds much less powerfully, of course. Fat produces almost no insulin response at all. Please get this right, for goodness sake.
Pancreatic beta cell, and it will load up with ATP. And it is this load up of ATP that ultimately allows insulin to secrete. Okay, here's where things get wacky. Normally, these pancreatic beta cells get a signal from glucose, and that fuels that cell enough to secrete insulin, triggers the cell to secrete insulin. if these pancreatic beta cells are constantly marinating in fats,
that means there is sufficient energy on board in the system, and sugar is not required in the cells. And as such, if the cells allowed sugar to enter, that would cause the sugar concentration to build up according to its concentration gradient in those cells and damage those cells. So the doors remain locked, the Randall cycle. The sacrificial lambs, if you like, are the red blood cells and the epithelial cells of the vascular tree, both of which can be replaced much more rapidly than muscle cells, pancreatic cells, liver cells, brain cells, whatever. This is the design, Thomas. This is what is supposed to happen. The pathological behavior here is the consumption of carbohydrates in the diet. That is the unnatural thing. That is the species inappropriate thing to do. That is the cause of pathology here. Not insulin resistance, which is supposed to happen. What's next?
Okay, especially saturated fats, because they take a longer time to break down. What happens is they have so much fuel already from the fat that when a signal from glucose comes in, it's not even a big deal. They don't respond to it. They have been
It's not that it's not a big deal. They don't respond to it because they are designed not to.
Bombarded so much with fuel from energy-dense fats that when glucose comes into the equation, they're like, oh, whatever, I barely need fuel. I've got fuel from fats already. In other words, the response to glucose is significantly attenuated.
As it should be.
Essentially, there's no need for the energy from glucose. So it means
there is no need for glucose, exogenous glucose, taken in from outside the body in the form of carbohydrates in the human diet. Not 1 gram ever. Simple.
Means that we're still producing insulin. We're just not really producing insulin in response to glucose as well. This is exactly why taking a little break from high-fat diets every now and then is very important.
No, it isn't. That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard you say, Thomas. What you ought to do as a human being is eat a species-appropriate, species-specific diet. And that is a diet consisting of the muscle meats and associated fats of large ruminant animals, grass-fed, if you please. Not carbohydrates at all in any amount, ever. Goodness me.
It doesn't matter whether you're keto or not. Taking a break from food in general can help restore this.
Yes, taking a break from food in general is a good idea too from time to time under supervision of the appropriate kind and advice from someone who is qualified to give it to you, Thomas. If you just mean not eating for part of any one day, though, that's not fasting. Fasting starts at 3 days. Okay, what's next?
And that's what's interesting, because there's a study that was published in the journal Diabetologia that took a look at this. They did an 8-week severe caloric restriction study where they put people on a 600 calorie per day diet.
That's not severe caloric restriction. Severe caloric restriction is close to 0, Thomas.
Is a lot of energy restriction. They found within the first 7 days, it restored their insulin levels and it restored their...
I wonder why. Maybe it's because the body had a chance to clear out all the toxic sugar that was causing the blockade. Wow. Incredible, isn't it?
Fasting glucose levels within 7 days. They also found that there was a decrease of intrahepatic lipids, so basically liver fat.
Yes, because there was not enough effective energy coming in to maintain the storage levels of hepatic fats and things, as well as in the blood and in the muscle cells and other places as well. And as such, the levels will drop. Well, goodness me, what a shock. What's next?
By 30%. And they found they were ultimately able to restore beta cell function. So my point in saying that,
the beta cells never stopped functioning, Thomas. If they do, you die. Unless, you then get to a point where you're on exogenous insulin and you're diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic. I mean, if they just suddenly stop working, you're going to die pretty quickly. But they don't suddenly stop working. People get time to get diagnosed and get in front of medical professionals often and get their insulin sorted and say, all right, now you're a type 1 diabetic. Okay, but the point here is the cells did not suddenly stop functioning because of eating fat. That's ridiculous. They continue to function perfectly as they should, which is to lock out sugar in those circumstances, as I think I've more than adequately described here.
Is that it's the overeating of foods, but especially the overeating of calorically dense foods, such as saturated fat.
Nonsense, Thomas. Absolute garbage.
That can trigger this beta cell unresponsiveness.
No, any amount of having sufficient energy substrate in either the form of fat or sugar or a mixture of both will lock out those cells. That is the design. That's how it's supposed to work. What's your point here?
But it is entirely fixable by changing the makeup of our diet periodically.
That's a very, very bad idea. Ever heard of the microbiome, Thomas? Go and look that thing up.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, but Thomas, you have neither. Neither do you have great power, nor do you have great responsibility. In fact, what you have is an incredible level of irresponsibility here. You are talking completely out of your area of expertise and completely out of your lane, and you are giving false, contraindicated, dangerous misinformation to people. Please stop it.
If you're going to eat a lot of, say, saturated fat and a lot of ribeyes, I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but you do need to flip that on its head now and then and allow yourself to regain beta cell responsiveness. That is your responsibility. Otherwise, you can absolutely develop insulin resistance while being on a ketogenic or lower carb protocol.
Well, that's no surprise because your cells are replete with energy in the form of lipids. Ergo, you do not require carbohydrates. For goodness sake, son.
Here's something that's very interesting, though. There is also something called saturated fat-induced apoptosis. This is where so much saturated fat is in the picture that it actually causes the cell to die. It actually triggers apoptosis, premature cell death. And what happens is
too much of anything will cause cells to disrupt and kill themselves off, Thomas.
Non-esterified fatty acids that come in from consuming way too much in the way of fats, basically so much fats the body just doesn't have time to deal with them. You have circulating NEFAs, non-esterified fatty acids. These non-esterified fatty acids can actually cause damage to what's called the endoplasmic reticulum, which is kind of a house for protein and calcium and things like that. To make matters very simple, it causes a massive influx in the cytoplasm of calcium. This influx of calcium in the cytoplasm causes oxidative stress and can actually cause...
Okay, what happens if you fill a cell up with tons and tons and tons of sugar, Thomas? Well, the cell undergoes a whole bunch of glycative damage to the lipid rafts, the cell membranes, the cell organelles, the DNA, and it induces apoptosis and the cell dies. What's your point? Eating too much food will damage your cells. Yes, we know that. Does that mean you should avoid fat?
Cause a cell to die. This can absolutely, this is a beta cell, right? It can affect how much insulin we produce because the beta cell is essentially dying early, not able to produce insulin. But there is a fix to this, or a preventative. There's a study published in the Frontiers of Pharmacology that found that oleic acid, okay, like that you would find in good quality olive oil.
There's no such thing.
This can actually prevent the damage.
Prevent is a cause and effect statement, Thomas. Have they done a study here on properly controlled human subjects in situ for any decent period of time to establish this? I doubt that very, very much because it's very difficult to get ethics for such studies.
From the saturated fat in the first place. They found that monounsaturated fats taken in alongside saturated fats actually negated or reversed the negative effects of the saturated fat.
Gosh, that's interesting because you'll find animal fat is a mixture of mainly saturates, absolutely, but also poly and monounsaturates as well. Perhaps in just the right amount to prevent a problem. Perhaps it's almost as if it's like that's what we've evolved eating for 4.5 million years, Thomas. Perhaps. Think of that? No? Okay.
Now, researchers hypothesize it has to do with the antioxidant
Hypothesis means guess.
content of the olive oil. Okay, so oleic acid has high potency antioxidants in it. Okay,
So does the earth if you connect yourself to it, Thomas. Okay?
got all kinds of different mechanisms there that it could be acting upon that are actually preventing the cellular damage that is occurring from essentially the lipid toxicity.
No, there's no such thing as lipid toxicity, Thomas, any more than what you would refer to in the same sentence as carbohydrate toxicity, as I described before, with too much carbohydrate, or protein toxicity if there's too much of that, or indeed water toxicity indeed, Thomas. If you drink too much of that, that can be toxic too. Okay? Don't talk nonsense, son. This is ridiculous. This is the worst video of yours I have ever seen. This is appalling.
Of so much saturated fat. One of the things I know you're wondering is, okay, well, how much saturated fat is the right amount?
Well, there you go. Eat saturated fat, by which we really mean animal fat in the form that it comes at the levels of different fats that it has in it, to satiety. Done. And don't eat carbohydrates, ever. Sorted. What's next?
Regardless of what diet you're doing, okay, whether you're keto, whether you're paleo, whether you are high carb and you still have fats, 10% of your total calories tops should be coming from saturated fat.
Where do you get that from, Thomas? How do you back that up? That's utter nonsense. The vast majority of your effective energy intake should be in the form of animal fats. Those are the facts. That's how we've evolved. That's how our organ systems are designed. That's how our metabolic system is designed. Where did you get that ridiculous number from?
Okay, it just, when you look at the...
No study to back that up, because there isn't one, of course. Not even an attempt to make it look like you might have done some study. No. Wow, Thomas. Wow, son.
Insulin resistance piece, it's a very important factor to weigh in. There's even some studies, if you look at a ketogenic diet specifically, they took a diet that was ketogenic, that was high saturated fat and low polyunsaturated fat, and then they compared that to low saturated fat with high polyunsaturated.
Without giving us the exact numbers, Thomas, and without telling us exactly what methodology was used, how long it was done, how many people, what were the demographics of it. This is just nonsense. A study was done. Who cares? You want to talk about a study, you need to analyze the study you want to talk about, and that's a video all by itself. These Vox Pop short videos of 10 minutes or so where you say a study says this and a study says that. Utter nonsense. Irresponsible nonsense. Completely unacceptable behavior, Thomas. What's next?
Fat. Not only did they find that the lower saturated fat group produced almost 3 times as many ketones.
What were the numbers that were being fed to these people? What level of control was being exerted? Were they locked in a metabolic ward to ensure that they complied? Was observation appropriate? I bet not. I'll bet you anything you like, not.
Okay, that's awesome. They also found that it negated the potential insulin resistance issue.
Insulin resistance is not an issue. Elevated blood sugar is an issue. Thomas.
Actually improved insulin sensitivity by having lower saturated fat and higher polyunsaturated fat on a ketogenic.
Well, that's a bad idea, isn't it? That's robbing Peter to pay Paul. There's no health benefit to be had by doing that. For a start, insulin resistance is indicated, not pathological, and eating too much polyunsaturates will predispose you to an increase in your chronic systemic inflammation burden, and we all know what problems that leads to. Oh, yes, heart disease, many forms of cancer, most forms of dementia, and almost all disease processes in some way or form, actually, Thomas. It's totally, utterly out with our biological design to consume any amount of polyunsaturated fat at all outside of what we naturally normally get in very small amounts mixed in with the saturated fats in our animal fats that we're supposed to eat. Okay? What's next?
Diet. And then they also found that it ended up decreasing or not increasing, rather, their cholesterol, the lipid profile.
Oh, for God's sake. If you could, could you make this video any worse, Thomas? Cholesterol. Good one, son. Oh, God. You've just got no idea, have you, at all? Please stop making videos about nutrition, Thomas. You are making an absolute fool of yourself here. Ridiculous. What's next?
So it's like, okay, if you're doing low carb and you're mad at me for doing this video because I'm talking about possibly lowering your saturated fat intake, consider what we're after. Do you want to eat your saturated?
You have no idea what you're trying to achieve here, Thomas, clearly. You have no idea about human physiology, no idea about human nutrition, no idea about anything at all. You're just talking through a hole in your head because you're popular and people are paying you money to put ads on your videos. It's irresponsible and you need to stop today.
Saturated fat, or do you want high ketones? Do you want insulin sensitivity? And do you want a nice lipid profile?
What is a nice lipid profile, Thomas? You don't even know what that is because you've just said cholesterol as if that was bad.
I mean, I'll eat my ribeye until I'm blue in the face. Don't get me wrong. But if I can throw some good quality polyunsaturated fats in,
there is no such thing in the diet, Thomas, except that which is naturally normally mixed in with the saturated fat in the animal fats as we are designed to consume.
there to negate the potential negative aspects of that, I absolutely positively will. So it's kind of sketchy when we understand that it's not just carbs that influence insulin resistance. We do have to look at the big picture. We're learning.
Yeah, we do, Thomas, and that includes being appropriately trained and competent in an area that you want to talk publicly to the great unwashed masses about their health, about human nutrition needs, about how they should change their diets around to increase their likelihood of health and longevity. And this is the worst video I have ever seen you make. This is absolutely, totally unacceptable rubbish from start to finish. Really, really not happy, Thomas, at all. Not happy at all, son. Right, there we go, boys and girls. I'm glad I got that off my chest. Just appalling. Join me next time when someone else will probably be wrong on Interwebs, because there really is a lot of that going on, isn't there, boys and girls? Yep. Okay. See you then.